Hong Kong history and sociology books in the past habitually trace the historical development of Hong Kong local consciousness based on its difference from China and success of the colonial rule in cultivating a sense of superiority in Hong Kong people over China. To cite some examples here, on the left is from a school textbook entitled A Pictorial Hong Kong History, published in fact by a Beijing-owned publisher, Zhonghua, which traced Hong Kong being separated from China post-1949, culturally and politically. And due to, it said, the rise in quality of public services in the 1970s, hence Hong Kong eventually developed a sense of collective memory and so on. Likewise, Hill Baker, professor of Chinese at SOAS, who used to be, who also worked in Hong Kong for a long time. Professor Baker has attributed the emergence of a Hong Kong identity to the construction of public housing in the 70s, free universal primary education in 1971, etc., and describes the Hong Kong man as active, competitive, adaptive, responsive, and contingent. They wear Western attire, speak English, and for those who do not, they wish that the children would speak the language. Today, however, I will draw from another version of history, a history of Hong Kong leftist cinema, to retrace a critique of colonial modernity within Hong Kong, an attempt to articulate a specifically Hong Kong modernity during the 1950s. I would argue that this part of Hong Kong cultural history has been repressed after the 1970s and relegated to be part of residual culture as part of the British colonial Cold War project in co-opting Hong Kong into a global capitalist world order from the 1970s on. Hong Kong leftist cinema, which has occupied a dominant position in the 1950s Hong Kong cultural scene. I say dominant in terms of commercial. It was actually commercially very popular. Was comprised of Putonghua and Cantonese-speaking productions. At the Hong Kong Film Industry Working Conference held in Beijing in 1964, Liu Shengji, Yau Ching, head of the Overseas Chinese Commission of CCP at the time, officially classified the Hong Kong film industry as, quote, different from that of the mainland and should be seen as distinct. He said, I think that Hong Kong cinema should aim at overseas Chinese and the peoples of Asia and Africa. He also said the artistic ideology, he thinks, should be that of the revolutionary bourgeois cinema, or, he said, of the new democratic revolution. Liu Qingqi wanted this bourgeois-informed Hong Kong film industry to become the supporting wing, the side flank of the socialist revolutionary and proletarian revolutionary film industry of the motherland. Now, when we talk about Hong Kong leftist cinema, usually people would think about Tsang, which is the three big film companies, Great Wall, Feng Wang, Phoenix, and Sunbeam. They formed the Hong Kong base camp of leftist filmmaking in the 50s and 60s. Until the outbreak of the Cultural Revolution in June 1966, this, I would call GPS group, GPS group, had shot 226 films. Most of these films did not engage overtly in advocating the party line of class struggles, but replacing it with a criticism on a moral, ethical level of capitalist society and life, of extortion and deceit, of greed and of luxury, advocating instead an independent character based on autonomy, self-strengthening, and the endeavor to fight it out. The company among these three who did Cantonese productions, Sunbeam, specialized in Cantonese productions and over the course of 30 years released some 100 titles. The guy who actually was director of this group, Liu Yue, said, capital was in short supply for our group, and pay was low, but nobody cared because we understood that we needed to shoot something that was beneficial to the Chinese social masses and their hearts or conscience. Liu Yayun, he was successively the general director of GPS companies since 1956, referred to their films as the patriotic progressive cinema. Born in Hong Kong, Liu has actually, I'm going to use him as a case study, his background for this group's personnel. He was born in Hong Kong. He worked as a war journalist in the front against Japan in 1930s in China, while working for a KMT newspaper, So Dong Bo. In Kunming in 1946, he witnessed the assassination of KMT secret agents of his friends, the opposition politician Li Gongbo and the poet Man Yat-dong. So he decided to return to Hong Kong, and in 1951 was appointed editorial director of the leftist newspaper Man Weibo in Hong Kong. So these leftist cultural personnel, I would say, in Hong Kong mostly had an anti-imperialist, anti-colonial background, and at the same time, they were disillusioned by the KMT rule in their experience. For these revolutionary-leaning cultural workers, issues of gender and sexuality were key to envisioning a new democratic society. A Phoenix film, The Wedding Night, for example, tackles the patriarchal dilemma of whether a newlywed husband should accept the fact that his bride is not a virgin on their wedding night due to her experience in the Sino-Japanese War. The film, although trying to show sympathy for both sides, clearly takes the position of the bride and critiques the feudal patriarchal value of requiring the bride's virginity as a condition to enter marriage. The female protagonist in this film is played by the so-called Phoenix, Princess of Phoenix, Sa Moon. She once wrote that, I seem to remember that the first contract I signed with Phoenix, the company, already stated that I did not need to attend any banquets, meaning that a lot of film companies require their key actresses to socialize with big bosses, but Phoenix didn't require her to do so. There were other film companies like Union, Zhonglun, which did not belong to the base league, but were born out of it, were highly influential by this group. Personnel of Zhonglun and Sunlun overlapped. In one Union pictorial issue, which is the magazine that this Union film company published, one could see on their 6th anniversary party, on the right side of the stage, you can hardly see it, it's kind of blocked out, but it's on the right side of the stage, you can actually see a CCP slogan, 多快好省. It hangs a banner directly citing the slogan from the 8th CCP National People's Congress of that year, 1958. 多快好省, which means achieve greater, faster, better, and with more economical means in building socialism. Union Film tried to rid themselves of an exploiting class, made itself a joint venture between 21 directors and actors in the form of a co-op. Now, in my study of Hong Kong film history, I've never seen any film companies that are run in the form of a co-op, except this one. It was not bound by distributors or the star system, decided to take a collective wage cut since they believed that an overly high salary for the actors, that i.e. stars, would affect the quality of production. So the salaries, all salaries were decided collectively. Producers and directors decided the actors' pay and vice versa. The Union Film redefined their social vision on a number of grounds. First, fight against Chinese feudalism, advocating free love and independence of characters. Second, criticize the unequal distribution of wealth and oppression against workers. Third, supported anti-imperialist, anti-colonial, and anti-corruption struggles. Fourth, against religious superstitions. These are some of their ads. As a visual artist, I'm very interested in looking at their ads. For example, which I actually find, visually stunning by today's standards. On the left is a film entitled Money. And on the right is a film called Human or People, Yam. Again, issues of gender and sexuality were seen in union productions as an essential part of their democratic vision. The film Swan Sisters, made in 1954, for example, in which domestic helpers became protagonists, criticized the unequal distribution of wealth and oppression against workers, and advocated sisterhood as a form of self-supporting community. Now, due to time constraints, I would mainly focus on two films today. In the Face of Demolition, Yau Ching was a critical and commercial milestone for union film. The film emphasized collective creativity and resisted individualism by approving communal self-help and mutual aid relationships. The line, one all for one and one for all, which helped to immortalize the film, was an attack on the feudalist family hierarchy. In the first scene, Dai Ban Wang, played by actually one of the two screenwriters, Lo done in for this film, taking advantage of the fact that he has lent money to the rent collector and that he's a comprador working for a foreign firm, takes up the privileged language of a colonial law to justify his occupation of an extra bed space without paying. He tells the rent collector that it would be an infringement of his rights if she rents the bed to a poor tenant instead of letting him use it for free, and says in English, actually this is his first line in the whole film, in English, you know, it's criminal. Later, Dai Ban Wang raped his wife's cousin, the recent immigrant from China, Ah Fong, and forced her to be his concubine. The feudal patriarch and the colonial capitalist are seen as collaborators, practically embodied in one character. The film praises Dai Ban Wang, who defends his individualist middle-class interests through citing the law in a morally condemnable position, thus rendering a critical distance towards upwardly mobile class identification and colonial capitalism. Not only does the film criticize the measurement and instrumentalization of human relations by capitalist logic, it also exposes without mercy the dominant classes which participate in the collaboration between the colonial government and the financial classes. Now, the struggles etched out in Hong Kong leftist cinemas were not in mainland China or Taiwan, but in Hong Kong at the time. The central theme of the film, communal, emotional, and psychological support, were maintained and expressed in economic terms. At the beginning of the story, a mid-aged couple with their newborn is being evicted because they couldn't afford paying the rent. They only manage to stay when the rent is covered by a cab driver, Roberta Wue, their neighbor, and Big Sister, a dancing girl. Both of these characters were played by union film shareholders themselves. Everything from paying rent to having dinner and birthday parties, buying coffins, staying in the hospital, and even giving birth are paid collectively by the neighbors. In contrast, blood relations are portrayed negatively in the film. Lo Ming, the main protagonist in the film, he has the cultural credentials to be a teacher, but education is not valued in this post-war economy with severe unemployment and cutthroat competition. He wants to celebrate his and Bai Ying's, his could-be lover, Bai Ying's birthdays together, but in the middle of planning, he finds himself thrown out of work and no longer has the money to throw the banquet. He feels ashamed because he's losing a literary space. Roberta Wue, the cab driver, helps with buying food again, but cannot change the menu, but can only change the menu from fancy cuisine to fish balls and noodles. Lo Ming finds this humiliating and blames it on Roberta Wue. Confucian values were seen in the film as an obstruction to understanding class oppression. This paves the way to Lo Ming's characterization in the later part of the film as a sellout, the one who betrays the entire household of grassroots folks. It wasn't until the end of the film that he regrets over selling himself to the capitalists and apologizes to workers. The film speaks of the alienation of and calls for a turning around, repentance of the intellectual. It shows how in a colonial society, placing the dollar above the letter, the intellectual is caught between two systems of ethics, between capitalist and cultural shames, serving to depict a self-reflexive disillusionment in colonial Hong Kong. In the end, Lau Ming does not make use of his uncle's economic capital and become a member of the middle class. These films, through their representation, presented a critique of professional aggressiveness while emphasizing on community support among the workers. Resistance against individualistic tendencies, critiques of the capitalists, and the collaboration between comprador middlemen and the legal system are highlighted, while there's no shame assigned to poverty, nor to working class women such as dancing girls, unless they succumb to greed. Rather, shame was to be found in the accumulation of capital at the expense of others. Another union production, Fu Yizi, Father and Son, shows how the office clerk father coerces his son, by all means, who has come to the city from rural China to become a competitive Hong Konger. He makes the kid wear Western clothes, bury his past, literally changing his son's name from Ha Zai Little Shrimp to Born Rich to Guai Sang, which the kid has a hard time responding to actually. Make him go to an elite school so that he can make friends with kids from the upper classes, etc. Eventually, the father finds himself in self-contempt and frustration. The elite school that forces its students to wear a uniform, franchise to a monopolizing and particularly expensive shop, all very commonplace by today's perspective now, is depicted as the school is depicted as bureaucratic, hypocritical, and completely out of touch with the actual conditions of the working classes, requiring Little Shrimp to hold birthday parties because every China school does that. As a tale of immense psychological and physical cost of a small figure striving to climb up the social ladder in Hong Kong, the film exposes the institutionalized violence against the body, against self-imagination and desire, how colonial capitalism fashions a new Hong Kong identity through reorganizing public and private spheres. It criticizes a Hong Kong characteristic that is the collaborative monopolization of elitist education and the charity industry on ethics and morality. Looking back, it was precisely because these films were designated by Beijing as bourgeoisie and the supporting wing, the side flank of the socialist revolutionary, proletarian revolutionary cinema of the motherland, that they had a lot of creative freedom and did not have to toe the party line of anti-racism, anti-racism, or class struggles at the time. Instead, they used realism as a tool to analyze class and colonial contradictions. In the birthday party scene in Father and Son, for example, the sons of rich families arrive with their maids in fancy cars. So the women, are dressed in black and white were the domestic helpers, their maids, dressed in particular attire. In this scene, you can actually see the neighbors of Little Shrimp in the ghetto look at their wealthy fellow students, their wealthy counterparts, as if the two worlds could never really meet, a remarkably acute visualization of class contradictions. In tracing some examples from Hong Kong leftist cinema, I seek to problematize the existing assumption that the rise of Hong Kong's native local cultural consciousness is seen as a result of a separation from China. The 1967 riots in Hong Kong, an offshoot of the Chinese Cultural Revolution, removed the patriotic underpinnings and thereafter moral backbone of the progressive cultural workers of Hong Kong. while simultaneously they faced Cold War containment from Taiwan and from the US, backed up by a series of colonial anti-communist makeover campaigns in Hong Kong. The eradication of the Hong Kong left by the collaborative move of the British Hong Kong authorities and the local and the global right wing could only come when the increasingly aggressive populist communist so-called extreme left in the mainland refused to recognize them. So Liu Yayuan, the director of this group, said in an interview, once the Cultural Revolution began, we were accused of running anti-revolutionary revisionist line, committing crimes and spreading poison outside the country. So Liu Yayuan, therefore, was arrested by the colonial Hong Kong government. And one of the key actors of this group, Hu Kei and Sat Wai, a couple of the key actors and actresses of this group were left to cinema, were also deported to China. The colonial Cold War depoliticization project, while suppressing this leftist cultural critique in Hong Kong history, replacing it with new lib values and structures from late 70s on, redefined the localized conditions for Hong Kong activism since. From today's perspective, this re-engineering process is epitomized by the so-called underlying rock spirit, which extol people to sacrifice themselves to capitalism. And even though its deadening work ethic has gradually fallen into bits and pieces post-97, the moral commitment to colonial capitalism has yet to be shaken. To wrap up, I just want to say that while I was researching on working on this presentation, I found an article online written by a friend of mine, a Hong Kong art historian, Sophia Law, entitled A Chronology of Artist Activities in Beijing newspapers in Hong Kong between 40 and 59, and found that she actually had a similar research project going on as mine. In her project, she found that actually some of these materials on pro-China artists were actually the hardest to find in Hong Kong art history. And then actually there were a lot of connection exchange between Hong Kong and mainland China at the time. And also how a lot of these so-called pro-China artists, they were from the grassroots, and they actually wanted to, they were all engaged in some form of anti-colonial activities, including supporting a labor strike against the government at the time, for example, train workers. So on that very positive note, I'm going to thank everybody for having tuned in today. Thanks. So I need to stop my share screen.
Hi, everyone. Really glad to be here. I just want to start by thanking the UCI Irvine Department of Asian Studies, Art, the Ph.D. in Visual Studies program, Humanities Commons, and especially Simon and Roberta for organizing this really exciting series and for inviting me to speak. I'll try my best to follow Yau Ching's really rich presentation that I think has a lot of interesting resonances with my presentation's treatment of the Cold War, and I'm looking forward to discussing all of that with you all. Okay, let me maximize here. So for this presentation, I wanted to look to the dominant subset of Hong Kong-focused diaspora organizing that embodies the type of politics that I call Hong Kong first. This can be summed up as Hong Kongers in Western regions who are staunchly non-partisan or bipartisan in their methods for advocating for pro-Hong Kong policies from their respective governments. So these groups are made up variously of Hong Kongers born and or raised primarily outside of Hong Kong, like myself in the latter category. Those temporarily outside of Hong Kong, like for school, those who have recently left Hong Kong, for political reasons, such as BNO holder immigrants, and finally those who are newly exiled, escaping arrest for their political work. So while there's a lot of political variation amongst the membership of any given Hong Kong first group, these differences usually remain on the individual level, while the organizational outlook and agenda typically conforms to this main mission of serving Hong Kong first. So there's also, of course, a lot of overlap amongst these various categories. But as this list hopefully shows, the Hong Kong diaspora is large and multifarious, both temporally in their relation to diasporic subjectivity. Obviously migration from Southern China to North America stretches back to the 19th century, as we all know, and the class identities of those those waves of migration have varied greatly ever since, but also multifarious in terms of political inclination. So to be more specific, some of the major figures that forward Hong Kong First policies that I have encountered in doing diasporic organizing include major lobbyist figures, such as Nathan Law, and the groups that work closely with them, such as NY4HK. More recently, numerous well-known Hong Kong political figures in the diaspora have put together the 2021 Hong Kong Charter, which forwards a politics of making allies and not enemies through a kind of inoffensive, nonpartisan politics that serves Hong Kong first against the CCP, and ignores other distinctions or dynamics to meet this goal. So indeed, the very first principle seen on this slide here of the Hong Kong Charter in their engagement with the world is to be nonpartisan and to connect with those that presumably already support Hong Kong. And such policies were put on display in the high-profile nonprofit Hong Kong Democracy Council conference this past April, which was characterized as the largest policy gathering for Hong Kong anywhere, and adhered to the mission of remaining bipartisan or nonpartisan in Hong Kong advocacy by including 7 Democrats and 7 Republicans as speakers, which included, politicians who have themselves supported anti-democratic policies in their own states, such as staunch Trump allies Rick Scott of Florida and John Cornyn of Texas, who forward, among other repressive policies, anti-immigrant and voter suppression laws. So prioritizing nonpartisanship in this Hong Kong First agenda stands in stark contrast to, for example, the Charter's later goals to stand for democracy everywhere, to call for mainland Chinese people to join their cause, and to join together with racial and economic justice movements around the world. So, I can perhaps agree with folks who see these Hong Kong diaspora groups and figures as accomplishing something for Hong Kong. I think that's undeniable, but I can't agree with the tendency to see their work as constituting the only work worth doing in diasporic organizing. During the dire circumstances of the 2019-2020 protests, there was the implication, sometimes implicit, but sometimes not, that all of us in the diaspora must share the same ideas about lobbying and state advocacy in order to be considered a Hong Konger. Diasporic advocacy for Hong Kong is critical, yes, but when that advocacy becomes premised on becoming as amenable as possible to state powers, it butts up against what I see as the diaspora's obligation to respect their relationality with the people on whose lands they are guests, such as First Nations and Indigenous people, for example, and also those whose labor form the foundation of the US under racial capitalism, namely Black people under plantation slavery and that labor's legacy today. So then one broader question stands. If Hong Kongers are fighting for freedom, democracy, and against oppression at home, then does that same responsibility carry forward to those in the diaspora and the political actions that they take? The argument of this presentation is that importing the frameworks of local politics in Hong Kong to the US or Canada wholesale, as these diasporic groups tend to do, risks very much assimilating into the power that Hong Kongers are putatively resisting. That is, local Hong Kong politics and the means to carry them out must necessarily change on the trans-Pacific route from Hong Kong to North America. In the same way that as international attention was focused on Hong Kongers for over a year, many made the argument that foreign observers and commentators must understand and respect local conditions and politics. So Hong Kongers in the diaspora should similarly respect the informed analysis of those, excuse me, who have been engaged and are affected most by the political and social conditions of their respective diasporic locations. And in the same way that the movement in Hong Kong was highly polyvocal, room should be made for the same type of polyvocal quality in the diaspora. So instead of Hong Kong first then, I want to highlight the political thought of former student leader Jackie Tsen-man-hei, who in 2019 called for a Hong Kong of the world. This framework, he argued, goes beyond self-interested policy advocacy and instead puts the abstract concepts of freedom and democracy into practice by building links with oppressed people fighting for self-determination elsewhere. By extension, then, this framework does not put Hong Kong on the back burner or exceptionalize Hong Kong, but it serves Hong Kong by emplacing it and contextualizing it within the world. So Chien put out his concept of this concept in an op-ed on Stand News in October 2019. He was commenting on the debate amongst protesters on whether to show support for the struggle in Catalonia in the wake of the mass arrests of the independence referendum leaders by the Spanish government. At the time, Chien identified the different arguments for and against showing support, ranging from the very real concern about possibly providing cover for the false characterization that all protesters are separatists, which would obviously enable the most severe legal punishments to be handed down, to the, in my view, less reasonable concern about possibly jeopardizing the passage of the HKHRDA US Congress. Chien challenges activists to expand their conception of the global as such, beyond interactions with state institutions or influence within global financial circuits. Instead, he outlines a form of political praxis that breaks free from the local, understandable preoccupation with Chinese governance and situates it within a broader global landscape of state repression, one that, in my understanding of Chien's argument, forcefully highlights the US government amongst the ranks of repressive state apparatuses, which should emphasize the need for Hong Kong to seek allies amongst grassroots resistance movements fighting for political autonomy and self-determination. So there are examples of this now in the burgeoning Milk Tea Alliance movement, which I have various thoughts on and we can discuss during the Q&A. To my mind, this is the centerpiece of what should be a reorientation of political scope for future resistance in Hong Kong and the diaspora, one that works alongside the backbone of local resistance like the New Union movement, especially considering the solidarity that has been shown to Hong Kongers in 2019 and 2020 has been overwhelmingly from the global right wing, from the GOP in the US, the Tories in the UK, conservatives in Canada, and then a smattering of fringe alt-right groups, all of whom could, care less about Hong Kongers, but simply intend to instrumentalize Hong Kong's geopolitical stuckness between US and China to further their own xenophobic agendas. So I often hear the refrain that we need to provide an understandable and appealing narrative for Hong Kongers in Hong Kong to act and to understand our message in the diaspora and our context here. This is undoubtedly true, but if the narrative we tell is one that is of exceptionalism and one that refuses to engage with the historical and political contexts that connect Hong Kong to the elsewheres of oppression, authoritarianism, slavery, and injustice, then Hong Kongers will forever be seeking help from those who merely want to use them as a card in their negotiating back pocket. So another short piece by Tony from the Hong Kong leftist magazine, The Owl, responded as well to the Catalonia issue, where he takes aim at those who have weaponized the left plastic or Zogao moniker to dismiss those that they deem to be insufficiently dedicated to the Hong Kong First creed. He highlights the contradictions in these activists' logic, saying, quote, "They do not ask whether standing in solidarity with the struggles of other countries is in line with their own values, only whether acts of solidarity would benefit their own fight in any concrete way. And yet the movement has persistently sought out international support, packaging itself as a vanguard of universal values. If you believe that you have zero responsibility to educate yourself and learn from others' resistance, how could you possibly ask those of other countries to do the same for us?" End quote. But Tony and Jackie's messages deviated from the overall struggle to gain the attention of various international states, media conglomerates, and then kind of unorganized shows of support from individuals. And I think their calls could not help but land flat in the midst of the protests themselves. Still, as the high tide of the protests and street battles have receded, and Hong Kongers unfortunately now have more time to reflect in private in this kind of different stage of struggle, the Hong Kong First logic deserves to be fully interrogated for its ethical and practical function. So with those critiques in mind, we have a different avenue to reorient how we think about transnationalism, solidarity, and the role of the diaspora and what to do with the Hong Kong First ideology. Though I'm not a part of any of these diasporic groups myself, since my politics draw me to groups who take different approaches, I did try to engage with them in January of this year in what I thought would be a clear-cut moment of agreement across our various viewpoints. I had helped to draft a rather tame statement that characterized the January 6th storming of the US Capitol by a right-wing mob as anti-democratic, and I have a screenshot of an excerpt here on the slide. Characterizing the storming of the Capitol as anti-democratic, quite literally, as the right-wing mob attempted to stop the counting of electoral votes. As something that Hong Kongers, we tried to ask folks to see this as something that Hong Kongers should find antithetical to their goal of standing for freedom and democracy everywhere. And every single major Hong Kong diaspora organization that we reached out to rejected signing the letter. Even major organizations in Canada, saying that it could cause trouble for them down the line when it comes to lobbying people like Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley, or that singling out Trump could alienate their outreach demographic, or that they do not want to meddle in non-Hong Kong issues. So pragmatics aside, I don't believe this framework made up of these various reasons for future Hong Kong diaspora organizing is tenable for a host of reasons. For one, as I gestured to before, any migrant, including immigrants, refugees, exiles, and so on, to North America become enmeshed and beneficiaries of the settler colonial state upon arrival, though obviously with varying levels of access to those privileges. On that level, a nonpartisan and uncomplicated petitioning and support for all logics support for all politicians in US Congress and the White House, for example, risks replicating the same colonial logics that Hong Kongers are fighting at home. For example, in the 1990s, Hong Kongers immigrating to Vancouver, Canada, were viewed in the same way by white society as many in Hong Kong now view those from the mainland coming to Hong Kong, as that is, as not caring about local conditions and merely coming to suck up resources and act in kind of an imperious or arrogant manner. Hong Kongers being similarly uncaring of local conditions in the diaspora now risks recreating this similar dynamic. And moreover, we all know how the Hong Kong government is entrenching rigid hierarchies of worth based on ethnicity, race, and class, which has simply been imported from the British colonial racial hierarchy, but tweaked for their own purposes. We can see how diasporic activists' dogged focus on engaging only with so-called Hong Kong-related issues and refusing to engage with domestic politics in the US mirrors the same nationalistic practice of pro-Beijing nationalists who pursue their agenda through a singular defense of the Chinese state, in particular its function of benefiting some while repressing others, which is precisely what Hong Kongers are fighting against, right? So the other reason is that I think that we need to kind of think more about this Hong Kong in the world framework, is that the US is also responsible for much of the problems that entrap and exploit Hong Kongers in Hong Kong. Not only through its support for China and their mutual economic integration since the 1970s, but because the US's self-interested meddling in the Pacific sphere during the Cold War and into today means that any temporary assistance to Hong Kong will remain just that, temporary. And if if history is any indication, the US will actively undermine and sell out Hong Kong at a moment's notice, like it did with Taiwan. So in my own research work, I examined the historical conditions that gave rise to US and Hong Kong integration under US global dominance after World War II, which I can talk more about in the Q&A if there's any interest. And so the framework that I'm developing in my own work connects the old Cold War with the so-called new Cold War to argue that if we're going to advocate for Hong Kong, we must see the historical conditions that entrap it, not just from China or the US, but both in collaboration with one another under our contemporary reality of an organically integrated global market. This wider historical view puts into perspective that the short-term immediate gains of international state lobbying that really took off around 2012 with student leaders like Joshua Wong have only helped to deepen the binary divides that foster Cold War thinking. That is, thinking about geopolitics that aid, a type of thinking about geopolitics that aids both US and China in mystifying what is in fact their deep integration and collaboration as capitalist superpowers, which they mystify by pretending as if they are ideological enemies in the old Cold War style. And so this goes to explain my view of the situation, which is that lobbyists engaging in real politics with people like Pompeo and Trump, last year, are not only outmatched on a policy level, but on a world historical level as well. This is not to argue that Hong Kongers are powerless, but actually quite the opposite. Rather that the socio-political forces that are pushing the world towards this so-called new Cold War are much larger than anything Hong Kongers could face on their own, even with the fiercest petitioning of the US. The old Cold War succeeded in reducing the world into binary opposing camps because it successfully depoliticized grassroots uprisings and funneled them into the state form in the West and in the Third World. So my argument is structural. The short-term gains of Hong Kongers in petitioning for beneficial legislation would provide some relief, yes, as lobbyists have done with the HKHRDA and HK Autonomy Act. But this work also legitimizes the system of state rule that disempowered Hong Kongers to begin with, as a still non-sovereign space with no political autonomy. And it only further entrenches the Cold War conditions that have brought Hong Kong to this point. So hopefully this very kind of brief sketch of Cold War history, which I can go more into detail after, makes it clearer why I think Hong Kong of the world as a framework and as a method is more suitable for resisting this so-called new Cold War of what is kind of this deeply integrated competition between two capitalist regimes. The political logic that only states may confront states is the logic of militarism and Cold Warism that we cannot afford, including those in Hong Kong who will be caught in the crossfire. The wave of grassroots uprisings across the world in the wake of state failure since COVID has resulted in most cases in retrenchment in the state form, like in the US. But if we link all these grassroots struggles across borders together, that puts much more pressure on states to enact lasting and real change over and above the incrementalism of lobbying through legislative forms. Thank you.
Daniel, I want to make sure that you're unmuted.
Can everyone see it?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'm Dan Tsang. I was born in Hong Kong and then I went away for college. And then I recently went back a few years ago on a Fulbright to the research protest literature in Hong Kong. And then went back more recently also after that to Chinese U, where I was witness to the occupation invasion by the riot police, Hong Kong riot police of the campus, and the subsequent occupation by radicals and students of occupation of this campus itself. After everybody left, I didn't leave. I still stayed there, and I took a lot of pictures. So what I'm focusing today is on what's left outside Hong Kong, actually, what is left among the Hong Kong diaspora, if it's left at all, in terms of ideological left. So I'm looking at how Hong Kong is imagined outside. I'll give some historical examples and talk about Hong Kongers abroad and how they are distributing their information, and then focus on a couple of issues that in the past, when we were activists in the different groups, we would talk about principles of unity. And in this case, it seems to be principles of disunity. There's some worrying permutations of the debate that has emerged among the diaspora. And then I have a few questions I list that we can talk about if we have time. So this was this is a NOC poll, National Opinion Research Center, on the future of Hong Kong in 1945, before Hong Kong was returned to the British. And the background of this was that Roosevelt had wanted to give Hong Kong back. Hong Kong, of course, was a pawn during World War II. And Roosevelt believed in democracy and not colonialism, actually. And he told Chiang Kai-shek at a meeting, at a summit, that he wanted to give Hong Kong to China, which was under Chiang Kai-shek then. And of course, Churchill blew up. And so this was a poll done in Chicago about what should Hong Kong be left with. I mean, what should happen to Hong Kong at the end of the war? And so actually the majority said they should give it back to China. So imagine the Americans were siding with the president then and wanting to give it back. And then this is a piece I wrote for Far Eastern Economic Review based on a National Security Council document that said that the US, and this was a few weeks after China was taken over by communists in 1949 in October. And the National Security Council recommended to the President Truman that Hong Kong be not defended. US said Hong Kong should not be defended if there's an attack by the Chinese. So that's what was highlighted on the screen here. They would not, under no circumstances or under present circumstances or any possible future circumstances, foreseeable circumstances. So Hong Kong is defined actually now in the OED, the Oxford English Dictionary, as a native or inhabitant of Hong Kong. This was a picture taken at Chinese Zoo during their graduation that was still allowed in November 2019. Among Hong Kongers born abroad, born in Hong Kong, but living abroad now, California actually has one of the largest. US has the largest, although Canada's numbers seem to fluctuate a lot more. But if you look at these census data, it seems like California has about half, almost half of the population of the US. So here is actually we are living in the state where there are many Hong Kongers, but of course their ideological perspectives vary. Asserting Hong Kong identity was a fairly recent thing, especially in the census. In the US Census, there has been a move to add Hong Konger to the terminology under other Asians. And the results haven't been out yet, haven't come out. But in Canada, A gay couple has also been fighting to add Hong Konger in Canada in the Canadian census. Then there was this poll that is not representative, but a poll of Hong Kongers in US and also US people in Hong Kong. And so they showed that the overwhelming majority rallied around the fight for autonomy. Majority strongly support the umbrella movement's goal of universal suffrage, and then later the 5 demands in the recent protests. But this is online survey, so of course it's not representative. One of the things that have happened is there have been media that's been set up in the diaspora, and one of the projects that I got involved in was to archive my interview with Edward Leung and into Cantonese. And so this Voice for Hong Kong project has archived a bilingual audio discussion from my interview with Edward Leung back in 2016 at Hong Kong U. And so here he's talking about the protests he can smell the gunpowder during the Mongkok fishbowl revolution. Some of the stuff that's been distributed online, or actually not online, but it's going to be mailed out, is Hong Kong literature. So there's a focus on trying to preserve Hong Kong literature, Hong Kong fiction, and this is an outfit in UK that is Hong Kongers in UK that is distributing publications from Hong Kong about Hong Kong fiction writing. And then this is another one of these examples of diasporic zines, Hong Kong zines abroad. This one is only in Cantonese, Flow Hong Kong. And Ray Wong, in exile in Germany, has penned an essay on what it means to him, the homeland, Hong Kong as a homeland. And then here's a translation of what he wrote, that the discussion on homeland is to enrich our knowledge. And he will quote from German-speaking world since he's in Germany right now. Another zine that is actually bilingual is published every month in Chinese and Cantonese first, and then in English subsequently. And so this is called Harbor of Freedom. Part of it makes me wonder if they are reading history in a way that makes sense. One article in this issue in December 2020 is they would think that Hong Kong should create the next East India Company. They forget that East India Company imported opium from India to Hong Kong, to China, and at the start of the Opium War. And actually at the end of the war, they had to be dissolved because they had gone too much power, and the Indians rose up to oppose the East India Company. So why would a Hong Kong diasporic person recommend that Hong Kongers create another East India Company? That just seems to be totally oblivious to history. Another one is another article in this issue advocates the return of McCarthyism. Actually, it argues that it wonders: is this tomorrow? Is McCarthyism the only way out? And they actually recommend reinstituting McCarthyism. Well, let me tell you what McCarthyism was. It led to many people in the State Department being fired for being suspected as communists. And many gay people were also fired from their jobs at the same time because they were associating queerness with communism. So they argue that US provides a good model, this is this article, in terms of resisting infiltration. Basically, any person or organization related to China, even if they're only of Chinese descent, should be suspected of a security risk and must be thoroughly investigated. Sounds like it's written by the FBI. Indeed, the Chinese community is considered to be mostly, let's see what it says, likely group is the mostly likely group to be incorporated in the United Front and therefore thereby become spies. There must be a reason for the United States to act so resolutely, and allies of the free world should follow their example. He's talking about the McCarthy period. Some people may worry about the reappearance of McCarthyism, but this depends on how the process is handled. Thank you. Everything has its price. If the free world, so-called, is still captured by morals and cannot be determined to reverse its infiltration, it will eventually be dominated by communist totalitarianism and can only live in regret. In the face of war and humiliation, they may choose humiliation. So they quote a Greek philosopher, Thucydides, about the secret of happiness is freedom. And it argues that, in fact, at least nine of the 159 people on McCarthy's list were confirmed to be Soviet spies. So that justifies McCarthyism. Here it ends with saying, to deal with these cunning Machiavellians, restarting McCarthyism is the only way out. Better dead than red. So this kind of anti-communism is just hilarious if it's not so scary. I think the writer has no idea what happened in the US under McCarthy period. And to argue that it should be restarted, if this person is in the US, will not be able to find any allies to work on Hong Kong. So I actually wrote on a similar topic when there was a red baiting in the Vietnamese community in Little Saigon. And I argued that the political changes underway in Little Saigon that may augur the end of reflexive, occasionally violent anti-communism that has marked the community may come about, because the younger generation is not necessarily as violently anti-communist as the older. This was back in 1999 in the LA Times. And more recently, in 2015, there was a PBS documentary on exposing the history of violence in Little Saigon against people that were suspected of being communists. Yet I understand actually why Vietnamese Americans support the struggle in Hong Kong, because many of them are ethnic Chinese. I did some research on Vietnamese Americans in Camp Pendleton, and there were so many Chinese from Hong Kong there who did not, from Vietnam, ethnic Chinese from Vietnam, who did not know Vietnamese or English, that the camp commandant requested from the US Consulate General in Hong Kong copies of Cantonese English dictionaries if they could find them. There were so many that they had to deal with ethnic Cantonese from Vietnam that were sent to Camp Pendleton. Gay Games is another event that's coming up next year. And there's a lot of promo material now on my Facebook. Every day there's a new promotion about this exciting event. Next year, it will be the first one in Asia, apparently, in Hong Kong. And so are they going to hold a gay game in Hong Kong with all this repression going on in Hong Kong? Is that kind of clueless? Already, a gay newspaper has questioned. It asked a question from the spokesperson of gay games about whether China might force local Hong Kong authorities to arrest gay game spectators from Europe, North America, or elsewhere if they make statements critical of China during the gay games cultural events. And this was last year in the Washington Blade. And the spokesperson, Shiv Paul, said, "We can't speculate on sensationalized, unconfirmed preconceptions." But the gay games did announce they would create a contingency planning committee. Good luck to them. Openly, we're talking about gays. There are 2 gay activists currently imprisoned in Hong Kong. One is Ray Chan, who is imprisoned for having attempted to vote or did vote in that primary that they have since considered illegal. Another is Jimmy Sham, who Ray was a lawmaker. Jimmy is activist on the street, and he's also in prison. So what are the gay games people, when they come to Hong Kong, if they come, are they going to pay solidarity to these 2? My questions for the group to consider on the audience is, how is anti-communism different in US and in Hong Kong? In Hong Kong, I figure the left has been co-opted by the state. And so what is considered the left in US is now considered the right in Hong Kong. People don't want to say they are leftists because of this conflation of left with communism. But in America, of course, the left is much more broad than communists. And so we need to reclaim that. So how will we convince Hong Kongers that joining the left is okay to fight for change? And will we actually enjoy fun and games while many of our compatriots, gay or straight, are in prison in Hong Kong? And so will gay games participants go visit or pay solidarity with protesters, or will they dare chant out 5 demands during the matches? That's my question. Thank you very much for listening.